The Nintendo 64 was a home console developed and released by Nintendo in 1996 in Japan and North America. The European release came a year later, in 1997. The concept of the Nintendo 64, often abbreviated to the N64, started fairly early. In fact, it began during the life cycle of the SNES. Although the console was already very popular at the time, the SNES faced increasing pressure from its competitors and began to slowly lose market share, especially to its main rival Sega, with the Sega Genesis in the late 1980s. Along with the Japanese recession, this hit Nintendo particularly hard and forced them to begin thinking about a successor to the SNES. It all began with Silicon Graphics Inc., a company that specialized in graphic visualization and supercomputing. They had managed to develop a new chipset that was incredibly power efficient and was much easier to produce compared to other CPUs of the era. SGI subsequently created a proposal for a video game system and began looking for an established partner in the market. Jim Clark, the founder of SGI, initially offered the proposal to Tom Kalinske, who was the CEO of Sega of America. Upon first impression, the demonstration impressed Kalinske as it seemed like the perfect chipset that could be used for a future console. However, further inspection by Sega's engineering team showed that the early prototype had several unresolved hardware issues. With these problems in mind, Sega refused SGI's chip design. SGI had to go back to the drawing board and spent some time resolving the aforementioned problems. Next, they contacted Nintendo. Jim Clark met with the then CEO of Nintendo, Hiroshi Yamauchi, in 1993. Unlike the last, this new prototype was much more impressive. This event marked the beginning of the Nintendo 64, and just a few months later, the two companies announced a development agreement surrounding the next console, codename Project Reality. The system to come was frequently marketed as the world's first 64-bit gaming console, with specifications superior to that of the PlayStation 1 and Sega Saturn. It was also stated that the console was so powerful that it was faster than the first moon landing computers. It may sound somewhat cavalierish, but Nintendo were not wrong. At the time, Atari had already claimed, although controversially, to have made the first 64-bit game console with their Atari Jaguar. However, if one were to be completely honest, while the Jaguar did use a 64-bit architecture, it had a 32-bit GPU, which made it not quite as advertised. This so-called 64-bit marketing campaign Nintendo planned was very aggressive. They spent $54 million advertising in North America alone, aimed at pre-teens in terms of audience. This cost Nintendo $100 per Nintendo 64 manufactured up until this point. This was very expensive, but Nintendo was keen to gain back the market share they had previously lost to Sega. Nintendo had also planned for the system to be priced at $250 at launch due to the console's more advanced architecture, but were forced to lower the price to $199 to stay competitive with the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn. After price cuts and a very expensive marketing campaign, the Nintendo 64 was successfully released in Japan on June 23, 1996. The launch was seemingly very successful, with the console selling out on the first day with all 300,000 units. Even the next shipment, which came just a week later, saw all 200,000 further units reserved by buyers before they were able to hit shelves. This success was a little surprising, as the Nintendo 64 only had 3 launch titles: Super Mario 64, Pilotwings 64, and Saikyo Habu Shogi, which was exclusive to Japan. Nintendo had always prioritized high-quality first-party games and said in response to the lack of launch titles, "We're convinced that a few great games at launch are more important than great games mixed in with bad ones." Evidently, the buyers seemed to agree given the sales data, at least for now. Nevertheless, the North American release was to come 3 months later in September of that same year. During this period, Japanese Nintendo 64s saw a price of $700 on import stores before postage and packaging for North American fans who wanted the console a few months ahead of the official American release. This truly emphasized the dedication of Nintendo fans despite the lack of games for the new console. After launch, the Nintendo 64 received generally favorable reviews from critics. Being the first true 64-bit console, many praised it for its advanced graphics and smooth gameplay, with some criticizing its lack of games, which came as no surprise. Many praised the console for its great games to come, the precision of the controllers, and even going so far as to say, fastest, smoothest game action yet attainable via joystick at the service of equally virtuoso motion. To be fair, the Nintendo 64 did end up having a rather large library of not just great games but genre-defining ones, many of which were first-party and probably exclusive, such as Mario Kart 64, GoldenEye, The Legend of Zelda, Super Smash Bros., Pokémon Stadium, Donkey Kong 64, Star Fox 64, Banjo-Kazooie, Pokémon Snap, Star Wars, Perfect Dark, and so much more. Yet despite all this success, one crucial decision ultimately sealed the fate of the Nintendo 64. The mistake was the cartridge-based format of the console. This cartridge limited games to a maximum of just 64 megabytes, whereas PlayStation CDs, for example, could store nearly 1000 megabytes of data. This did not only limit the physical size of games, but made it incredibly difficult to develop on for third-party developers. Because of this, the Nintendo 64 could not keep up with the PlayStation when it came to sheer volume, as third-party developers found the PlayStation an easier system to develop games for. Eventually, there ended up being just 388 games being released for the Nintendo 64, significantly less than its competitors. Even with less games, the Nintendo 64 had high-quality titles and would continue to outsell the Sega Saturn throughout the 5th generation. It would, however, trail behind Sony's PlayStation. Eventually, the Nintendo 64 would go on to sell a total of 33 million units worldwide. Today, the Nintendo 64 remains one of the most recognizable video game systems, as it was a console which brought a large number of fantastic exclusive titles, many of which are still going strong. So in that regard, perhaps Nintendo were not wrong to have mainly focused on first-party games as their legacy continues to shine brighter than ever.